the Ukrainians are putting too much resources in Kharkiv direction, which is the main reason Toretsk front collapsed. In today's video, I will cover the changes of the front line for the past week. Then I will talk about why Ukrainians want to jump into this Russian trap. Today's video covers information up to July the 7th. In Kharkiv direction, near Lipsy, for the past week, there is no big change in the contact line. Russians drop FAB bombs every day. The Ukrainians suffer heavy losses and made very little progress. In Vovchansk direction, the battle heat up. The Russians start counteroffensive and capture a small area of these blocks. Here is a factory where the Ukrainians put a lot of soldiers in. The Russians used FAB bombs every day to bomb this area. The Ukrainians made little progress here, so they changed the tactics. On June the 29th, the Ukrainians crossed the Vovchansk river and entered these blocks. If the Ukrainians continue to push north, they will be able to cut the supply line for this factory area. In the east of the city, the Ukrainians made successful counteroffensive and retake this area. So now the Ukrainians control the east part of the northern Vovchansk, but the Ukrainians suffered heavy casualties. For example, on July the 1st, the Ukrainians made 7 attempts to cross the river. 5 attempts are trying to evacuate the wounded soldiers, but the Russians use FPV drones and artillery to attack the Ukrainians on the river. The Ukrainians lost 50 soldiers in one night. Now the Ukrainians call the Vovchansk River the River of Death. For the past week, here the main battle force for Ukrainians are 57th Brigade and 36th Brigade. The 82nd Brigade are rotated out of the battle. From the Russian side, the main battle force is still the 3rd Air Assault Brigade. The 2nd Guards Spetsnaz Brigade also have battle report here. From the Ukrainian COD report, 3 assault groups of 138th Motor Rifle Brigade has arrived for reinforcement, so it's still early to say who will win the Battle of Vovchansk. But for the past week, the Ukrainians suffered much more casualties than the Russians. In Luhansk front, the Ukrainians start counteroffensive near Terny and retake some areas, and they also attack in the forest. This is the gray zone. Here 2 Ukrainian brigades have battle report, the 44th Mechanized Brigade and the 66th Brigade. The 12th Azov Brigade used to be positioned here, but there is no battle report for the past week. From the Russian side, the main battle force is 25th Army. This is a newly formed army in May 2023. The main battle force is 67th Motor Rifle Division. For the past week, the 3rd Motor Rifle Division of the 20th Guards Combined Army also has battle report. In Bakhmut direction, the Russians are making progress. On June the 30th, the Russians captured Spirny, which is a very small village. After Russians captured Rostovivka on June the 26th, they continue offensive along this railroad. Here the main battle force is still 106th Airborne Division, along with some former LPR brigades. From the Ukrainian side, it's still the number 10th Assault Brigade. They haven't had rotation for like forever. In Chasiv Yar direction, the Russians make significant progress. On July the 2nd, the Russians finally captured this micro-district. The first time the Russians get into this area is on April the 14th. It took the Russians around 3 months to conquer this area. This is very difficult. The Russians have to go through 5 kilometers from Bakhmut to attack this area. After they capture this micro-district, they will be able to use it as an attack base to cross the canal or enter the forest and attack the Chasiv Yar main district. Here the main battle force is the 98th Airborne Division. According to Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the Russians may not attack Chasiv Yar directly. They may attack in the south, cross the canal, and attack this Dupochki. Here is a big area of open terrain. The Ukrainian COD report says the Russia's 150th Division and 11th Air Assault Brigade may attack along the T-504 road. In the coming week, we will see where the Russians will start the offensive. In Toretsk direction, for the past week, the Ukrainian defense collapsed. We have to use the word collapsed. On June the 19th, the Russians start the offensive. On the first day, they breached the line and pushed 1.4 kilometers. On June the 23rd to 30th, the Russians expand 5 kilometers and get into the residential area. On July the 2nd and 3rd, they attacked along the residential area and controlled 1.4 kilometers long. On July the 3rd and 4th, they continue to attack and reach the center of this town. Why the Russians make significant progress so fast? From the Russians' telegram, there is some interesting information. There is a 3 kilometers long tunnel. Only the former Donetsk miners know this tunnel, and now they are working for the Russians. So the Russians go across the tunnel, get into the residential area, and attack the Ukrainians from behind. That's why they breached this line. In New-York direction, the Russians also made progress. The Russians attacked along the railway. On July the 27th, they pushed forward for 1.4 kilometers. And up to July the 7th, they pushed 4 kilometers long and almost reached the center of this town. In the east, there are still some trenches. The Ukrainians may have to withdraw or they will be surrounded. So we can see this is a totally collapse. The Ukrainians don't have enough soldiers or they just don't want to defend this area. Here the main battle force for the Russians are 132 Brigade, which is former DPR force, which is former DPR force. They are the local people and they know this area very well. After they breach the first line of defense, the Russians are bringing more troops for reinforcement. The 27th Motor Rifle Division has arrived. The 506 and 589 regiment of this division have been deployed in this direction. For the Ukrainian side, the 24th Brigade and 41st Brigade are very much responsible for the collapse of this line. The 71st Jaeger Brigade used to defend this area, but in June, they were transferred to Kharkiv for the stupid counteroffensive. The Ukrainians are putting more resources here for reinforcement. The 95th Air Assault Brigade are transferred from Liman to Toretsk. We will see if they are able to stop the Russians. In Pokrovsk direction, the Russians continue offensive. On July the 2nd and 3rd, the Russians finished clear up Novo-Alexandrivka and attacked north and reached the outskirts of Vovchansk. This is very dangerous for the Ukrainians. This village is the only settlement before the T-504 road, which is the main supply road for the Eastern Front. In the south, the Russians continue to attack Sokio. On July the 29th and 3rd, the Russians already captured Sokio, and they continue to push west into the next village, Yevhenivka. In the southern part, the Russians push along the river and captured this area. So now, in the east of this river, the Ukrainians only have one big settlement, Novoselivka, Persia. The Russians are attacking from the north and from the south to approach this village. Once they capture this village, they will be able to push west towards Pokrovsk. Or the Russians can be more aggressive. They can attack west without capturing Novoselivka, Persia. Before the Ukrainians have proper defense in the west, the Russians used to take this kind of risk and successfully captured Ocheretine. We will see if the Russians will be more aggressive to attack west. In Krasnohorivka, after the Russians rest for 3 weeks, now they enter the northern residential area and capture several blocks. The Ukrainians in the east may be encircled. In Konstantinivka direction, the Russians continue to push west and capture some areas in the fields. In early July, the Russians already approached this town and reached the outskirts. We will see the Russians can attack this town from 3 directions. They can attack from east, from the south along this road, and in the north. The Battle of Konstantinivka may start in July. To conclude the past week, actually 4 weeks ago I said Vovchansk is a Russian trap. The Russians want Ukrainians to bring more troops into counteroffensive. Name one example. The Ukrainian 71st Jaeger Brigade. They were defending Niu-york and Toretsk direction, but transferred to Kharkiv for this stupid counteroffensive. Ukraine is putting too much resources in Kharkiv direction, which is the main reason Toretsk front collapsed. So why Ukrainians want to jump into this trap? Because Zelensky demands General Sursky that there must be a Ukraine counteroffensive in 2024. So your boss set a stupid KPI and you have to do it. If you are General Sursky, where would you choose to attack? Kharkiv, of course. It's Russia's newly captured area. Thanks to Ukrainians' lack of preparation, this area has very few trenches, but even if you push Russian back, there's no strategic value here. Pokrovsk and Toretsk has strategic value, not Vovchansk. So I have to show this picture again. This is what it looks like when your boss set the wrong KPI and the whole company have to follow. When the boss look down, he can only see shit. When everyone else look up, they only see assholes. That's all for today. This is Jason Zhang from Shenzhen, China. Thank you for watching and see you next time.